Hello everyone, welcome back for this new episode of Coding Design System with George. Hello George, how are you?
Hello, Mads. What's up?
I'm well. I'm working on a lot of things right now. Still these onboarding videos, so there's still a lot of work on it, but we're gonna have it at some point,
Guys,
yeah.
wait for those onboarding videos inside Backlight. It's gonna be special, huh?
It's gonna be legendary. And we're here today with a friend of mine, so I'm really happy to have him today on the stream. So we're here with Gaël, that is coming to talk about the documentation. Hello, Gaël, how are you?
Hello guys, I'm fine, and you?
I'm fine. It's a real pleasure to have you today because we know each other for a long time right now,
Few
and
years.
a few years, yeah, exactly, coming from French conferences like Paris Web, dedicated to accessibility and so on. And you have a kind of big career because you work in different places in different environment, like different web agencies. You work for Orange, which is a French old telecom entity, government entity. And you're also core maintainer at Bootstrap. So you're working on a lot of different projects and different things, and you're especially involved in maintaining the design systems right now in your current position at Onepoint, and previously in Orange and so on. That's it. I'm correct.
Yes, exactly. I work at the tech lead in front end development, and especially in accessibility too. So I work a lot on public services in France. So design systems and accessibility mostly. And I work currently on almost 4 or 5 design systems at once. So that's legendary too.
And how does it work? Are they all inherited from a core design system, and the different ones are inherited from this one, or are they totally independent and separated projects?
No, that's some of the biggest issue I I have right now. They were a first design system for a client a few years ago, and people at this time thought it was a good idea to completely do the whole thing by hand. So they made an Angular website for the documentation. They made a lib for the components. They splitted a lot of things. And for the next design systems, they thought they will pick up a few things, but not everything, and start over some things that were out of date. And there, I think the latest one is ninth or 10th design system on the stack. So they all share something in common, but they are all different. So I work at Onepoint for a year now, and my mission is to get the latest two, improve them, and try to get back to the previous ones. Um, so this means mostly using externally for website documentation, web components for the documentation, which should be shared across all design systems. And so that's a pretty hot topic right now. The design systems solution inheritance.
Yeah, this is not always something easy because you may have to backport things, or you may have to, yeah, I don't know, to find a way to maintain different layers of compatibility, even when your different design systems are evolving in different directions. So it's not always that easy. Okay. Are you confident
Pretty fun and interesting. So, but,
And you've been involved in the new because I heard about this new design system for French government.
No, I'm not involved in, but I followed it since a few clients using our design systems or public services. So they should apply the design system from the French government. But the latest design system we produced was a year ago, and a year ago the official design system was only beta and had a few breaking changes. The only week I studied it to check if we could use it or not, so we didn't. But visually, we have two design systems currently that are exactly the same that the official one, but we had to produce it by ourselves.
Okay, so they're duplicates of the official one, and you have to maintain the compatibility between them. That's it.
Yeah. But they are only visually the same. Exactly. The latest one we chose to go with Bootstraps for the HTML and CSS, and Lion for the web components, mostly forms. So the mashup is pretty easy, but we had to implement the visual design system of the government on top of this. So it was more easy that it sounds.
Yeah, because there is some part of the official one that you can reuse, like, I don't know, the tokens, for example. So you can re-import the token from the official one and derive your design system from it.
We can't do it directly because they use tons of SAS variables everywhere, splitted everywhere. So there is a basis, but we can't use it as easily as it sounds. However, we have the code base and the values exist. So this is already a big step.
Let's talk a bit about documentation, because this is something you really love and you're definitely involved in. So across your different projects you worked on, what the main pain points in your opinion about documentation, or when people comes to documentation?
Yeah. In fact, there are two main pain points. The first one is pretty obvious. It should work, and people should find what they are searching for. So having a good search form working, indexing all the content, so things like that are the main pain points, because the solution I work on and I inherited from at Onepoint didn't make it really good. So this is the first step.
What is a good search result? It's actually something very interesting. We are actually building right now, Gregory, if you watch it, building the new search for the design system documentation, and we kind of understand that it needs to be a lot more than just finding the title name. But what would you define as a very good search solution?
The first thing is really to search in the content, every word, every single word, because you may not presume, you may not assume what people will use as a keyword to search things. A side project that could lead to a good search form is having a glossary or a dictionary of the terms used. Because mostly developers might not know what's the difference between a modal, a dialogue, a pop-up, things like that. So you won't know what words will be used to find something. So having a great content with simple vocabulary and your search looking for every word in the content is a really first step. The second one, in my opinion, is to categorize the results too. Showing a full list of contents is not helpful at all. You need to prioritize them. If you find a match in the title, this is probably a good match. If you find in the lead paragraph it's also a good starting point. But if you find the word in the at the end of the content, for example, this is probably the last result you should show. So both are very important. On the Bootstrap documentation website, we use Algolia, which is really good at indexing, but also has a very nice way to display the results by highlighting the keywords and displaying a small intro of the content after the title. So when you're searching for something, you have the titles highlighted, but you also have a short description of the content. And I think this is helpful for people.
The nice thing about Algolia, I talked about it with Gaël recently, and he told me that on a previous project, probably on the Shopify design system, when they implemented Algolia for the search engine, the Algolia team told us that they could add hidden keywords in data attributes along the documentation. So you could easily force the indexing engine by saying, okay, this title don't have the keyword that people are probably searching because it's not related or it's not really relevant in the title by itself. But you could explicitly ask the engine to index the content for those keywords specifically. And they finally did it because Algolia also had a metric engine, a statistic engine embedded in it. So it's really helpful to see the different terms that I searched inside the documentation and which ones are leading, why people are searching these terms specifically, and which page they could probably access to when they perform this specific search that doesn't pop up in the search results box and so on. So yeah, this ability to add some kind of flexibility and to tweak the search engine is probably something really helpful when you are working on a really big documentation like those on design system.
Yeah, metadatas are really important because there are a ton of things we won't think of writing, and metadatas can be whatever the language, the technology, the requirements, the dependencies. When you're documenting components, for example, it could be useful to know that you need another component before it. Like in Bootstrap, if you want to use the popover, you need the tooltip script. This is not an immediate thinking for developers. So if you don't use metadatas and if you don't make cross references link between components, between contents, you will lose someone at some point. Cross references links are really helpful when you search for specific design tokens, or if you're in a component that needs some context. Writing it in the docs might not be the best place, but using cross references link solves the whole point. So this is also something important.
Because we're talking about this way of discovering content in terms of documentation. Yeah. Do you see other things like metadata to improve the discoverability inside the documentation itself to help people to access different pages that may not at first pop in your at top of your mind when you're thinking about a specific context in the documentation?
As I mentioned, the cross-reference link, having some callouts or warnings or just content that could pop up in your documentation and draw your attention of specific points. This is something to consider too, because very often in the design system, when you're documenting components, you'll focus on your components, of the use cases, on the requirements and the how-tos. But if you, I don't know, if you're documenting a modal component or dialogue components and you don't mention accessibility, you are at risk that some developers try to use it and forget a few things. So when you're working with web components or React or Angular components, you can make some attributes or properties required for accessibility. But when you're just like Bootstrap HTML patterns, these things can't be enforced. So with that, drawing the attention of the people watching documentation on this, you are at risk, literally. So in Bootstrap, it's quite fun because literally everyone uses Bootstrap. So we are not speaking to developers nor to designers, but to everyone potentially. At work, it should be developers using the design system most of the times, at least the technical part of the design system. So it's easier to enforce things. Something that's not really with documentation, but I consider a good practice is to share configuration files like editor config, ESNet configs, and such files, which could really help to enforce the best practices. So,
Yeah, especially for accessibility, and that's part of one of the links on Backlight mastery for components library. There is this post that I actually wrote as to why use open source component libraries, and one of the major aspects of it is accessibility. Because when you use those components code, you get that accessibility with it. So when you use a combo box, you get that accessibility. When you use that drop down, that pop-up that you mentioned, that is built in. When you use just style, then you rely on the HTML to be to have the proper ARIA tags or specific attributes that makes it accessible properly. So that is actually something that we usually recommend, and there is actually also a page of the best open source component library to base your design system on if you're interested. So in React, for that matter, we have some of the best options, I think, today.
that's why I really love Lion as a web components library, because mostly for forms, as I said, they are really, really good from an accessibility perspective. So and they are completely style agnostic. So you can apply whatever you want and just work the way you are used to, and get them styled the good way. So I really love Lion for this.
Yeah, you get that accessibility right out the box, and it's true what you mentioned. Like the work they've done on the form aspect of it is quite deep. It is well supported. Yes.
Yeah, and they are really active under the hood. So when you discuss with them, you send an issue or you open a pull request, you have an answer in the day. So it is really, really great.
Probably half of them by your end.
Joran, if you are looking, yeah, definitely. There was a nice anecdote in the last episode with Thomas, with one of the core maintainer of Lion, and we implemented a simple button with lit in design system, and he told me they re-implemented the button in Lion 4 times because making an accessible button is incredibly hard. So they had to revamp it 4 times before having a real accessible button into the library. So yeah, it's really complex to build them from scratch, and that's why basing your work and your very own design system on existing open source library is probably your best choice.
Accessibility is a challenging topic. You want to have the collective efforts of open source here and not just do the same mistake of everybody again and again.
Yeah, and speaking about documentation, accessibility is something very interesting. It's transversal. You cannot speak of accessibility on a single page in your documentation for your design system. You have to talk about accessibility in your color design tokens page, in your typography design tokens page, in your components, almost everywhere. Finally, so you cannot have a single page for accessibility, or if you have an issue somewhere.
That was my question actually, because this is something I've been thinking, is whether you have that accessibility page. And some design systems out there have that. They have an accessibility page, and then they bring in every single aspect of accessibility that you should think of. Or should you have it into single elements everywhere, or both? I don't know. But that is still a question up in the air for me.
On Bootstrap, we do both, because people might not know about accessibility at all. So we have a page with the best practices, with the choices made in Bootstrap regarding accessibility.
Raising the awareness, basically.
Yeah, and talking about the real specificity. There are a few things that we cannot document elsewhere. Finally, like the fact that we check the prefers reduce motion media query to enable smooth scroll in CSS. These things is documented in the accessibility page. It's also mentioned in the reboot section, since in Bootstrap it goes in the reboot, but there is no feature or page dedicated to this, so we have to mention it several times in several pages. And having accessibility page, a centralized accessibility page, is also useful when you start to make cross-references links between components, between a few things. Because, for example, still in Bootstrap, every transition and animation is dropped when the user has shown through the media query prefers reduce motion, that it doesn't want animations. We have to mention that make a call out regarding animation for each component, because if we don't, we have issues that are raised by people that are just using I don't know, the progress bar, and the animation is not working, and in fact they, in their own system, in Windows settings, for example, have disabled animations, and they are complaining that on Bootstrap animations doesn't work anymore. So this is really important to have centralized documentation for accessibility, but also mention every point everywhere. So cross-references links, metadata, callouts, and things like that are very, very important. But very often they are second-class citizens in documentations.
You keep mentioning the Bootstrap documentation, so I have to bring it up.
For your information, Boosted is a fork of Bootstrap, and that's how I got into the Bootstrap core team. In fact, I spent I spent 2 years working on Boosted, and I was alone to maintain the whole Bootstrap.
And we have that famous accessibility page.
Exactly. You have a few mentions regarding color contrast. You have visually hidden content to remain accessible without being visible. Reduce motion, focus visibility, which is a specificity of Boosted. It doesn't exist in Bootstrap. This needs to be explained in such page, but we also have to mention it regularly in the other docs.
So taking your example, if we go to progress bar, we're gonna have a call out for animation.
Yeah, on Boosted, I'm not sure they kept the animations, but if you go, which should have it. If you go to carousel, yeah, maybe.
Yeah, it's there.
Is it something that you can automate in your pages, like having an external component for the callout, and when you redact your documentation, you include the I don't know prefer reduced motion callout, and it just injected into the page?
This is exactly how it works. Bootstrap documentation website and Boosted's one is based on Hugo. In Hugo, you can have shortcodes, and we use it almost everywhere. Finally, for touch callouts. So we have a few ones that are just drop-in callouts like this. We also have shortcodes to display. If you go at the bottom of the page, you should have a few contents like SAS variables, which are just a few steps above. Here.
It's a very nice documentation, by the way.
Yeah, and in fact, the variables here are not written in the docs. This is the real source files. We have SAS commands, starting with SCSS docs, I guess, and we have a Hugo shortcode parsing our SAS source files to check for these specific commands. And there is one at the start with the keyword to identify the section, and one at the end. And we are simply passing the SAS source file to display the content in Hugo. So whenever you need to add a new variable, for example, you don't have to document it. It's already in the doc. We can see, for example, that we have a styling disable line command, so at the middle of the variables because there is a calc usage, and so this is really useful to have such shortcodes. Those are really game changers for people using the Bootstrap or Boosted.
Yeah, I want to try now the option. I think we can switch it off. We can simulate it, right?
Prefer simulation, yeah.
I guess you're under Chrome, I guess?
Yeah, I'm on Edge, actually.
Yeah, so it should be the same thing. You should have a render tab, and in the render tab, you should be able to access some kind of a...
You can have a render tab.
Yeah, but it's hidden by default. Yeah, you have to edit.
Rendering?
Yeah.
Nice. Show an overlay of emulate. Not this one. Those are the preferred colors. Those are the forced colors, and those are the contrasts. Reduce motion. There we go. The proof is in the pudding.
That's it.
Yeah,
very nice.
If we didn't use callout to mention the behavior, people keeps complaining about it without knowing this is an accessibility feature. Not yet a requirement, but it should be, obviously. So yeah, it needed to be mentioned, and it needed to be mentioned in multiple occurrences. Yeah.
How do you architecture your different parts of your documentation? I am personally, I'm a big fan of the dialectics framework. I definitely love it. But this is just one documenting framework across many others. So is there because you showed me the work you did on some specific design system and documentation based on the official government design system. And so how do you organize your mind, and how do you enforce the contributors of the documentation to follow those guidelines when documenting different parts of the design system? Is there a specific architecture for it?
Yeah. In fact, this is really opinionated, and it came from the design system I inherited from. So I'm not really aligned with the choices, but it kind of works really well finally. So we have three main sections on every documentation website. We have the principles. This is a huge word to mention anything probably. It's used by mostly by the designers and UI and UX designer to mention the navigation patterns. For example, the animation principles you're supposed to use. So this is the first section where, for example, the accessibility page resides. We have the second one, which is dedicated to the design tokens. We generally call it the basis, because it's not only the design tokens. We might find the utility classes, for example, in CSS. And finally, there is the components. So components is pretty obvious design system. So and we try to stick to this architecture. In the tool we created, it's enforced because it's a path based. So you drop your content on the good path, and it's displayed the right way. A bit like Backlight does with slash stories, docs, etc. tests. This is a kind of convention, and I personally kind of dislike it because it cannot evolve. You have to stick it from the maintainer has to declare this architecture, and it cannot evolve afterward. The contributors cannot make it different, so it's not flexible enough for me. But it works quite well because people successful to use it and contribute content. So it's simpler, for example, than the boosted and bootstrap docs, which have you can count almost a dozen of sections. The distinctions might not be really really clear, really, and having only the principles, the basis, and the components, you have a very clear content architecture.
Okay, and how do you link some kind of dependencies? Because one thing we talked often with Stace, our lead designer at Divriat, is this necessity to keep track of kind of history when you are to explain the choices, specifically design choices, when you are working on a component like a button, and you're saying, okay, I'm using this primary color for the button, but this is not an arbitrary choice. I mean, there is design decisions and design principle behind it. And it's also important when you are working with the button and you are reading the documentation to understand why there is those choices in terms of tokens and so on. So how do you keep track between those different kinds of elements, like this button is using those and those and those tokens because it's important in this specific context and so on?
Yeah, in fact, Bootstrap for this specific case is really bad because it doesn't explain the differences. It simply shows the choices you have, but since it's supposed to be customized, it doesn't enforce any convention on the usage. In Onepoint design systems, this is mostly the content that leads the explanation. We may have in the most advanced documentations use cases with we have a web component to display do's and don'ts pictures, and the more the design system is mature, and the more we find do's and don'ts use cases everywhere. So in the case of buttons and variants, you have the first meaningful documentation is regarding colors and their usage, and the next one is regarding buttons, if they are used as call to actions, if they are used in forms, if they can be applied to links or not, because not all button variants might be applied to links, for example. So this is something that's driven by the content and mostly contributed by the designers.
That's interesting. It reminded me the article series we had on the Backlight blog dedicated to ESLint, how ESLint could help your team to enforce some kind of use cases. And in this specific use case, you could have ESLint rules that forbid the use of specific variants when you're using your button in a link rendering mode. So if your button is a link, then those variants should not be enabled, and you could trigger an error when validating your use case of design system in the specific context.
Yeah, as I said, such tooling are really useful and probably needed for any team using a design system. Enforcing the best usage, the best possible usage for components is not possible without such tooling. So yeah, definitely. I'm personally a big fan of something I call defensive CSS. That's recently used on another way. That's what I had in mind a few years ago when I started defensive CSS. But I tried to use on my development environment CSS that are extended using attribute selectors, for example, on some classes or element selectors. For example, a button class that should not be applied on a link. You might explicitly add the button element selector on your class locally when you're working as a developer to ensure the style won't apply to a link. And when all the developers know the procedure, it can work really well.
Yeah, this is another way to really just enforce people and push them in best practices way.
Yeah.
So definitely, and talking about this ability to access different kind of states and variants and so on your components. What's your opinion about using of stories? Because we talked a lot about writing documentation, but stories in the storybook sense format is also a good way to document your usage of different components. So what's your opinion about it?
Personally, I really like the way stories are written, not for the documentation part, but for the testing part. Testing that every variant, every use case, every data you feed your components with will work is really, really easy with Storybook. So I really like this ability to make clear examples and real use cases finally in Storybook. Apart from that, the tool itself is really big and probably too big for testing cases. But I really like this ability. Showing live content, live example, and live demonstrations shouldn't require such thing like Storybook. In fact, the Bootstrap website and Boosted only displays HTML and CSS, and you don't have a whole framework around this. So I think it should not be needed for the documentation, but it's really interesting for testing cases.
One interesting thing that we use we've implemented in Backlight is the ability for each component, to declare documentation along our stories and so on. And you have different way to implement your documentation, like using MDGS. And something that I really like about MDGS, I don't know, George, if you can have an example about it. Probably in a starter kit, like I don't know, maybe the SAS one, or it should be. Let's have a look at it. MDGS allow you to embed your stories inside your documentation with just a simple snippet of code. and having the ability to just include the story directly without having to worry about a whole framework to carry is something that I really like. I guess the SAS one, maybe the SAS one of something.
The Simba one.
The Simba one, yeah, the Simba one definitely. And thanks to the MDGS framework, it's something really simple to do as just including a code block with the exactly with a GS preview story prefix. You have your stories declared in the stories file, and you could just import the stories and just
with this. Yeah. So this is invisible, but you do the import, and here it's importing web components, and then you inline. So this you inline a story, and the story is then here rendered inside it.
In fact, in our design system, we have a web components doing exactly this. And we use the web component because in some projects that are dedicated to Angular, for example, we use Angular Playground instead of Storybook or anything else. But using the web components allows to be agnostic from any tool. And it's very interesting because you might even use the src doc attribute on iframes to just inline your HTML patterns, and it works really well. So we have the exact same thing. Less I don't know how to say. Not really as easy because we're using on almost all of our design system, we're writing the docs in ASCII doc. So the shortcode in ASCII doc mapping to web components is pretty early to write, but it works very well.
It's actually in this example, I mean, we could have gone straight with the web component, but yeah, that notation gives you the frames and this, but also when you're just using attributes, that's okay because you can just do it in HTML. But when you want to use properties, this is where things get a little bit more complex. And I wonder if we have.
This is where Storybook is really good at thing with this.
Yeah, the different controls and the different knobs.
Yeah.
So you see here, for example, this specific playground has a callback on click with code injected, and this is provided by Lit directly. So you kind of get the power of Lit and having properties filled in that HTML will not provide out of the box.
This is something interesting. In the last episode with Thomas, we talked about the fact that probably you should use web component for everything. Know that we can have server-side rendering thanks to tools like Rocket and so on. So he said something interesting, saying if you need a layout in 2 columns, you could make a web component just to handle those 2 columns for you. So maybe it's a good thing to think of it like a way to enforce things and giving your different developers and documentation contributors some kind of web component saying, okay, this component is to handle the tokens, this one is to handle specific stories and so on. So it's a way to abstract the layout and when you write documentation and just put some slots with different elements of your documentation and everything is generated right away.
Yeah, and in fact, in our design systems, we always use the same components. So I'm currently trying to externalize them to have a dedicated lib for the web components for documentation. So it's not part of the design system itself, but it's part of our tooling to document the design system.
It's funny. We should join effort because we built Dockit core which is a library dedicated to do to have enriched features in your documentation. So you can have a caption, you can have showcases of colors like this, and so it's like you can showcase fonts. So it's like a showcase of all the things you can do. And we have space if you want to show spacing. And we, on one branch, I think, because we also are working on a React one and a stencil one, but we're also bringing up on the web component. We're gonna have do and don'ts. So it's interesting if you do something, how we can join effort here.
Yeah, this is exactly the kind of things we are doing and trying to do, because for now, each design system, even if they're using the same tools, all have their own specifications. Someone, I don't know, change the way you provide a label or the icons or something. And in fact, this is nonsense to duplicate such tools.
Yes, exactly. And as you said, doing web components for this, which is what we're building in Dockit Core, we're building a set of components. We actually have a branch with new stuff coming in. Those are web components, and those will be quite nice for just enriching Markdown with a few components. And that's obviously you can use it in Backlight, but you can use it also outside of any Markdown solution.
Yeah. For ASCII.doc, for example, you only have to write a macro that you will map to your web component, and it works. It works really fine. So indeed, web components are definitely the good choice.
Yeah, always bet on web components, folks. This is definitely the future.
Yeah, you were speaking of layout and the example of two columns, but Hayden Pickering and Andy Bell wrote and sell every layout, which is methodology, and I don't know how to define this, but this is really awesome. And they have the the teaching part regarding rudiments and axioms, which is already great, but they also provide examples for almost every layout you might have you might need, and they are delivered as web components. You can just embed them as a web component, and it works fine. So and they only do layouts, so there's no tricks, no weird features. This is just layouts.
Yeah, definitely. I do love this project, and if you don't know it, folks, yeah, have a look at every layout. It's definitely the best way to structure your mind map and your mental model when talking about generating layout and building architecturing content in your different pages.
A really good investment.
Yeah, definitely, for sure.
And you said that they do deliver web components of it.
Yeah, I think you need to be logged in to have it, but for each component you can download a zip file, and it's delivering the HTML, CSS, JavaScript when needed, and the web components. So you can use it the way you want. If you only want the markup, or if you want the web component, you can. I think it's a great way to deliver layout and to abstract it.
Great. I guess we're slowly reaching the end of the session, and it was really nice.
I think we could have done more, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I would.
We just scratched the surface.
Oh yeah, it's but documentation is just a pillar of your design systems.
Never-ending story.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. But that's one of the most interesting part. how you bring people to the documentation, how do you help them to contribute to it and consume it and so on.
There's something we didn't mention, but which is, in my opinion, really important, is how to make the documentation enjoyable and memorable. Because people don't only need to find what they are searching for, they need to remember it to make less searches, for example, and they need to like the documentation websites they are using, because if it doesn't work, if it's laggy or something, it's really fast annoying website. So a documentation website really need to be enjoyable and useful to be used simply.
Definitely, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I'm a big fan of reading documentation. I'm not really good at writing it, but I do love reading it. And each time I'm picking up a new project, the first thing that I do is to pick the documentation and go through it from A to Z. And I'm just trying to understand it. And if at some part of during the process I'm just giving it up because it's not enjoyable enough, or I don't understand things, or I have to do a ton of back and forth between different sections to understand how it works and so on, then I'm pretty sure that I won't be happy with the project by itself. But if I can go through it from A to Z, it's a real pleasure, because when you read the end of the documentation, you're saying, okay, I'm feeling more powerful about it. I know how to use the project, at least on the basics, and I know where I could find some kind of documentation, because when I will be lost, I will remind that, okay, I saw something when I read the documentation at the first time. So I know that I could search for something and I will find my answer somewhere. And yeah, I do agree with you. You have to make it enjoyable.
The best project I know regarding this is the Tailwind CSS documentation. It's really awesome, and to make some ad, Adam Wedan talked to Sarah Diane from Algolia on their podcast regarding developer experience, and they mostly talked about documentation, because they put most of their efforts in Tailwind is for the documentation, and this is really really visible when you're searching for something in Tailwind documentation. You feel the love that's placed in the documentation. So this is really something amazing.
Yeah. Right now, when I'm working on different CSS elements and different CSS projects, my first source of documentation now is Tailwind documentation before jumping to MDN. Because I know that I have just to find a class, and I will have some different properties directly in the documentation. I will be okay at saying, okay, it was like this. I'm reminded.
Exactly, you have the basic knowledge of what the property does and what the values does, and this is really 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 done. I don't know. It is really fantastic what
they are simply on a quest to get the best documentation out there.
And it looks so beautiful. And definitely it's a real pleasure just to jump on it, to access the content and read the content in it.
Yeah.
We won't get paid for that, and we won't have a check, but
No, but I already made some ads for Bootstrap. So speaking of Tailwind, is
yeah, it's a, I guess it's a right balance. It's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for being with us today. It was really cool to have you on stage, and I hope to invite you for a next session. Maybe when we release the search engine in the documentation, in the design system documentation in Backlight.
Yeah, we put it through you, and you tell us how good is it.
Yeah, for sure. That would be great.
Now Gregor is dating us.
Yeah, yeah. A bit more of pressure, Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for today. Thank you, George, for this new session, this new episode. Next week, we're going to have Ben Holmes on the show to talk about the islands architecture. And it will follow the last episode with Dak about 11T. So we're going to have probably a great moment about it. Really looking forward to it. But in the meantime, thank you very much, Gaël, for being with us today again.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Gaël. Nice to meet you.
And enjoy the rest of your day. And see you next week, folks. Bye-bye.
You, bye-bye.
Goodbye.